She was just a waitress, until she finally made the autistic son of a millionaire, whom the greatest experts in Utah couldn't even touch, eat in peace. It seems unlikely, doesn't it? But what happened in the sophisticated dining room of that restaurant, amid the clinking of crystal glasses and whispered conversations, forever changed the lives of a cold man, a lonely child, and a woman everyone preferred to ignore. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, like it, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The air at the canyon's edge was thin, a carefully cultivated luxury that cost as much per square foot in Salt Lake City's most expensive neighborhoods. The sound was a controlled murmur, a symphony of silverware clinking against china plates, crystal glasses meeting in hushed toasts, and business conversations flowing like an underground river. The smell was a complex mix of truffles, burnt butter, and the expensive perfume of the people who frequented the place. Amid all this orchestrated perfection, James Covington's table was an island of jarring silence. It was a heavy, dense silence, charged with the electricity of a storm that refused to subside. James, a man accustomed to bending financial markets to his will, felt naked and powerless in front of a small plate of gourmet macaroni and cheese, untouched and mocking. Failure tasted bitter, and he could taste it in the back of his throat, more real than any dish the chef could create. James could feel the stares, or maybe he just imagined them. It was hard to tell. The people in his circle were masters of discretion, but he knew the curiosity that lurked behind the polite smiles and quick glances. He was James Covington, the titan of real estate development, the man whose picture was splashed across business magazines, the widower whose tragic story was whispered at charity events. But right now, he was none of those things. He was just Leo's father, and that was the only identity that mattered, and the one that broke him the most. His tailored suit, which normally felt like armor, now suffocated him, and the Swiss watch on his wrist seemed to count the seconds of his public failure. Every second that passed while Leo's food went cold was a testament to his incompetence, proof that all his wealth and power were worthless against the invisible barrier that surrounded his son. Leo was in his own world, a private universe that James had no access to. The boy, with his brown curls that were the exact image of Sophia's, rocked gently in his chair, a rhythmic, self-contained movement that was his only defense against the sensory bombardment of the restaurant. A low, steady hum emanated from his lips, a sound that only James could decipher as a sign of growing distress. His eyes, large and expressive, focused on nothing in particular, but seemed to see everything at once, making the simple act of looking at a plate of food an overwhelming task. The food, a specially requested plate of macaroni and cheese with the mildest cheese and the softest pasta, was a threat. It was a change in routine. It was a demand. And Leo's world was crumbling under the weight of the demands. Years of therapy, dozens of renowned specialists, each promising a key, had resulted in this: a deafening silence in an expensive restaurant. Across the room, Chloe Miller moved with an efficiency that bordered on invisibility. She was a cog in the restaurant's machinery, trained to anticipate needs, clear empty plates and refill glasses without interrupting the flow of conversation. Her uniform was impeccable, her smile discreet and professional. But behind that facade, Chloe saw the world differently. Her eyes didn't just register a table with a difficult customer. They saw the full geography of pain. She saw the tightness in James's shoulders, a kind of tension she knew intimately, the tension of someone who fights a losing battle every day. She heard Leo's humming not as an annoyance, but as a language, a desperate broadcast of overwhelm and fear. It was a frequency she had learned to tune into years ago, in the quiet of her brother Ryan's bedroom, and one she had never been able to turn off. A silent war raged inside Chloe at that moment. Every fiber of her professional training screamed at her to ignore it, to walk away, to let the manager handle the problem. To get involved was to break protocol. To get involved was to risk her job, the job that paid her bills, and kept alive the small flame of hope that she would one day return to college. And there was another voice, older and darker, reminding her of the dangers of getting close to men like James Covington, men with power and money who saw people like her as pawns to be moved on their own chessboard. She had been a pawn once before, and she had nearly lost everything. But then her gaze returned to Leo, to that small body vibrating with anguish, and the memory of Ryan's face on an equally bad day overshadowed the scene. Empathy was a physical force, a tide rising in her chest, and she knew she couldn't live with herself if she turned away. The decision was made without conscious thought. It was a surrender, an acceptance that there were more important things than protocol and ancient fears. Chloe set the silver tray she was carrying down at a nearby service station, the clang barely audible over the hum of the restaurant. She took a deep breath, an act that seemed to shift the world back on its axis. Her shoulders, once tense with the weight of the day, relaxed into a posture of purpose. To the casual observer, she was still a waitress. But to herself, she had become something more. She was about to cross an invisible boundary, to enter personal and fragile territory uninvited. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was wrapped in a layer of determination that made it bearable. She felt the weight of her manager's gaze on her back, but she didn't look back. Her focus was entirely on the island of despair in front of her. She approached the table with the ease of someone walking on thin glass. Each step was deliberate, designed not to startle, not to impose. James watched her approach, and a wave of irritation washed over him. He braced himself for a pointless interruption, and, "Is everything all right in here, sir?" that would force him to lie with a tight smile. His hand curled into a fist under the table, ready to dismiss her with cold politeness. He didn't need pity, and he certainly didn't need the help of a waitress. What could she do that the best child psychologists in the state couldn't? The presumption of the gesture offended him. One more small humiliation in an afternoon already full of them. He lifted his chin, ready to throw up a verbal wall, but the words died in his throat when she did something no one, absolutely no one, had ever done. Chloe didn't address him. She didn't look at him. She completely ignored his imposing presence and his obvious wealth. Instead, she walked around the desk and in one fluid, unhesitating movement, knelt on the expensive hardwood floor. The gesture was so unexpected, so radical in its simplicity, that it silenced James's irritation and replaced it with pure shock. Kneeling. She placed herself on Leo's level, not just physically but symbolically. She relinquished all authority, all adult height, all employee status. It was an act of surrender, a signal that she was not here to command or coerce, but to find. In that simple movement, she demolished the hierarchy that defined the world and created a new space, a level space on the floor where only she and Leo existed. James watched, his mouth slightly open, feeling as though he was witnessing the beginning of something he had no words for. Still on her knees, Chloe remained quiet for a moment. She didn't reach out. She didn't try to touch Leo. She didn't speak. Instead, she simply existed in the space with him. Her gaze wasn't on the boy, but on what he saw. She followed the line of his peripheral vision to a silver fork that rested beside the plate. She watched as the light from the chandelier fragmented on the curved surface of the metal, creating a small rainbow that danced as the air moved. To James, it was a fork. To Chloe, who was now trying to see through Leo's eyes, it was a kaleidoscope, a source of fascination and perhaps overload. She understood that Leo's world wasn't empty. It was overly full, a cacophony of details that most people filtered out. The food wasn't the problem. The food was just one more detail screaming for attention in an already deafening world. James watched, fascinated and terrified. He saw his son, who normally flinched at the proximity of strangers, stop rocking. The rhythmic movement slowed until it stopped altogether. The low, anguished humming on his lips faltered, fading into silence. Leo's eyes, which had been wandering without focus, seemed to settle not on Chloe, but on the space she shared with him. It was then that Chloe made her first move. Slowly, she reached out her index finger and touched the wooden leg of the table, creating a soft, hollow sound. She touched it again and again, a rhythmic pattern, slow and predictable. It wasn't a demand, it was an offer, a sound in the silence, a point of focus in the chaos. And then, the miracle. Leo, for the first time that afternoon, turned his head and looked, not at Chloe, not at his father, but at her finger, at the source of that soft, methodical sound that had cut through the noise of his universe. The silence that settled over the table was of a different quality now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of frustration, but a fragile silence, as thin as a sheet of glass, that James was afraid to break with the simple act of breathing. He became a statue in his own body, every muscle locked in forced stillness. The sound of Chloe's finger tapping the wood of the table was the only real thing in his universe, a metronome measuring time in a new era of possibility. All the noise of the restaurant, the distant clink of silverware, the whispers of the other diners, all of it dissolved into a formless hum in the back of his mind. All he could hear was that sound. Ring, ring, ring. It was the most hopeful sound he had ever heard, more promising than any words from any expensive specialist he had ever hired. In that sound, there was a language, one he did not understand, but one that his son, for the first time, seemed to hear. Chloe felt the energy at the table shift. She felt James's stillness, and more importantly, she felt Leo's focused attention. It was an opening, a crack of light in a door that had been closed for years. Her intuition, honed by countless nights of trying to decipher Ryan's silent world, told her not to rush, not to become greedy for more progress. Trust was a slow-growing plant. She kept the rhythm steady for a few more seconds, establishing it as a safe haven, a sound that signified calm and predictability. Then, with calculated subtlety, she introduced a small variation. She paused a little longer between two beats. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It was a tiny test, a question asked without words. She was asking, "Are you still with me? Can you handle a little surprise?" Her entire body was tense, her senses focused entirely on his response. Leo's response was barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but to Chloe and James, it was monumental. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, his head tilted slightly to the side, a gesture of pure curiosity. His lips, which had been buzzing with anguish, parted slightly, and then came the sound, a soft, barely audible click of the tongue, echoing the pause Chloe had introduced into her rhythm. It was a response, a mimic. It was the first move of a conversation. James felt a jolt in his chest, a jolt of pure emotion that took his breath away. Communication. His son was communicating, not with words, not with taught gestures, but with a spontaneous sound, a direct response to an offer of connection. The simplicity and depth of it hit him like a tidal wave. Knowing she had established a two-way street, however tenuous, Chloe began the next phase of her delicate operation. The food on her plate was still the Everest they needed to climb, and she couldn't just jump to the top. She had to build a path step by step. Keeping pace with the tapping, she began to move her hand slowly, millimeter by millimeter, over the polished floor. Her finger, still tapping, left the table leg and traveled toward the white tablecloth that fell almost to the floor. The change in surface altered the sound, making it more muted, less resonant. It was a new sensory variable, introduced gradually and safely. She was guiding Leo's attention, moving his focus from a fixed, safe point to a path that she hoped would take him closer to the world he had rejected. From Chloe's perspective, the world had shrunk to the tip of her finger and the journey of a few inches in front of her. She could feel the texture of starched linen beneath her fingernail, a fine, stiff weave that was completely different from the smooth wood of the table leg. She was aware of every detail, the way the shadow of her hand stretched, the faint smell of starch from the tablecloth, and most of all, the weight of Leo's gaze following her movement. She wasn't just moving her finger, she was weaving a non-verbal narrative. "See," her movement seemed to say, "we can explore, we can touch new things, and the world won't fall apart. The sound may change, the feel may change, but I'm still here, and the rhythm is still safe." It was a lesson in trust taught through the simplest of actions, a demonstration that change could be gradual and not frightening. Her finger finally reached the edge of the table, the point where the linen met the dining area. The silver fork, once an object of dread to Leo, was now only inches away. James held his breath so tightly that he felt a pang in his chest. This was dangerous territory. The fork was directly associated with the demand to eat. Would Chloe make the connection? Would she risk breaking the spell? With the same deliberate slowness, Chloe's finger stopped its rhythm on the tablecloth and instead reached forward and poked the tip of the fork's handle. The contact produced a new sound, a metallic clink, sharp and clear. It was a clean sound, different from the hollow thud on wood or the muffled thud on fabric. It was an invitation to a new sensory game, using one of the pawns from the old battlefield. Leo's reaction was one of immediate fascination. The new sound, so distinct, captured his attention completely. His head lifted a little higher, and his eyes fixed on the fork, as if he had never seen it before. It was no longer an instrument of culinary torture. It was a source of interesting sound. Seeing that there was no sign of distress, Chloe repeated the action. Clink, pause, clink. She was doing exactly what she had done with the table leg, establishing a pattern, creating predictability, transforming a threatening object into something neutral and even amusing. She was, in essence, dismantling the weapon. She was draining the fork of its negative power, rewriting its function in Leo's universe from tool of demand to producer of interesting sound. James watched, marveling at the genius contained in such simplicity. What happened next made James's heart stop and start again at an irregular pace. After watching Chloe play with her fork for almost a full minute, Leo's small hand, which had been resting in his lap, began to move. It was a hesitant, trembling movement, like that of a wild animal emerging from its den for the first time. He lifted his hand, fingers slightly curled, and reached across the table. It wasn't a movement to grab the fork. It was more subtle, more meaningful. He extended his own index finger, perfectly mimicking Chloe's gesture, and with a delicacy that belied his earlier anguish, touched the other end of the fork. The touch was so light that it barely made a sound, but it was an act of willing participation, a gesture that crossed the chasm that separated him from the world. In that moment, the dam James had built around his emotions for 3 long years broke. Watching his son's finger, his tiny, unreachable Leo's, willingly touch that fork was like watching the sun rise after an endless night. A burning heat rose in his throat and exploded behind his eyes, blurring his vision with tears he refused to let fall. This wasn't about the fork, it was about the choice, it was about the bridge. For an instant, the pain of losing Sophia, the pain of watching his son struggle, the crushing loneliness of his journey, it all merged into a single, overwhelming wave of gratitude and relief. The woman kneeling on the floor in her simple waitress uniform wasn't just getting his son interested in a fork, she was giving him back a part of his son he thought he'd lost forever. Chloe recognized the immense significance of Leo's gesture. Any wrong move now could destroy everything. With incredible slowness and control, she withdrew her hand, sliding it away from the fork. The gesture was a transfer of power. "It's yours now," her silence said. "You're in control." She didn't smile, didn't make a sound of approval. Leo's reward was the absence of an overreaction, the continuation of calm. Letting Leo explore the fork with his own finger, she then leaned forward slightly, and using the tip of the fork closest to her, she gently separated a single piece of pasta from the main mound on the plate. She moved it to an empty area of the plate, isolating it. The object of her anxiety was no longer an overwhelming mountain, but a single small item, now part of the same game as the fork. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. The noodles, now alone in their white porcelain expanse, became the center of Leo's universe. Before, they had been part of a mountain, a jumble of shapes and textures that his brain couldn't process. Now, they were just a thing, a small curved tunnel, a soft yellow color, and a smooth surface. Chloe, with her infinite patience, had given Leo the gift of focus. She had isolated the threat, dissected it, and presented it not as food, but as an object of study. James watched, and for the first time he began to understand. This wasn't magic. This was translation. Chloe was translating the chaotic world into her son's language, a language of singularity, patterns, and controlled stimuli. He, with all his money and expertise, had always tried to force Leo to learn his language. Chloe was doing the opposite. She was learning and speaking Leo's. Chloe's stillness was her most powerful tool. She didn't rush the moment, didn't offer the noodles, didn't make any suggestions. She let Leo take his time. After a moment that seemed like a lifetime to James, she moved the fork again. With the tip of the tines of the fork, she touched the side of the lone noodle and slowly spun it into place. A slow, lazy pirouette over the white plate. The movement was hypnotic and crucially exhilarating. The food, the enemy, was now a toy. It was dancing. The last shred of demand was drained from the situation, replaced by a lightness that had seemed impossible just a few minutes ago. It was a silent invitation to see the world differently, where things didn't have to be scary, they could just be interesting. Leo's eyes followed the spinning motion with an intensity that was almost palpable. His body, previously a knot of tension, relaxed visibly. He leaned forward, a tiny movement but one that signified deep engagement. The finger he had used to touch his fork retracted, but it was a gesture of focused observation, not retreat. He was completely captivated by the small spectacle before him, the hum of the restaurant, the movements of the other diners, his father's presence. All of it had disappeared for him. There was only him, the quiet woman on the floor, and the small piece of pasta dancing a safe distance away. For once, curiosity was a stronger force than anxiety. It was then that Chloe made a bold move, one that might have broken the spell, but that her intuition told her was necessary. Keeping her gaze fixed on Leo's plate, she reached out with her other hand and with excruciating slowness picked up the clean fork that was sitting next to her own place at the imaginary table. She held it in the air for a moment, mirroring the situation. Now there were two forks in play, hers and Leo's. The action sent a subtle but powerful message. This isn't something I'm doing for you. It's something we're doing together. We're equals in this exploration. She was turning a lonely, daunting task into a shared experience, removing the isolation that had been such a big part of Leo's suffering. With her own fork in hand, Chloe began a pantomime of moving beauty and precision. She pretended to spear a piece of food from an invisible plate in front of her. Each movement was exaggeratedly slow, clear, and deliberate, designed to be easily processed by Leo's brain. She lifted her empty fork into the air, turning her head to look at him with an expression of gentle curiosity, just as he was doing with his food. She was becoming a mirror, modeling not just the action, but the emotion that accompanied it. Calm, interest, assurance. To James, watching it all, it felt like a sacred dance, a choreography of empathy so profound that it seemed to transcend the very reality of the noisy restaurant around them. The air grew thin as Chloe began to move the fork toward her own mouth. Time seemed to slow down, stretching out every millisecond. James could feel the blood pounding in his ears. This was the final act, the connection Leo had always rejected with screams and panic. The fork traveled through the air in a slow, graceful arc. Chloe's gaze remained neutral and calm. She didn't look at Leo to check if he was watching. She trusted that he was. Her trust in the process was absolute, and that trust seemed to radiate from her, creating a bubble of calm that enveloped them all. She was showing him the entire path, from start to finish. No shortcuts, no surprises, just a predictable, safe sequence. Chloe raised her empty fork to her lips and pretended to eat. She made a small sound of satisfaction, a soft that was more of a sigh than a word. It was a positive sound, but not overly excited so as not to scare. Then she set the fork down gently on a napkin. The demonstration was complete. The cycle had come full circle. She had traveled to enemy territory and returned unharmed, even content. And then she stood completely still. She didn't look at Leo. She didn't look at James. She simply waited on her knees on the floor, offering him the gift of silence and space to process what he had just witnessed. The next move couldn't be hers. It had to be his. The choice had to be entirely Leo's. The silence that followed was the loudest of all. It lasted 10, maybe 15 seconds, but to James it was an eternity suspended in time. He watched his son, who stared at the solitary noodle, then at the fork, then at Chloe's now passive face. He could almost see the gears turning in his mind, connecting the dots of the demonstration he had just seen. And then it happened. With a determination James hadn't seen in years, Leo reached out and grabbed his own fork. It wasn't a tentative touch this time. He held it in a closed fist, an awkward but firm grip. It was an act of intention. It was an act of agency. In that moment, Leo was not a passive recipient of therapy. He was an active participant, ready to try his own experiment. The concentration on Leo's face was total. His brow furrowed into a small knot of effort, and his tongue peeked out of the corner of his mouth. He maneuvered the fork, which felt enormous in his small hand, toward its target, the single piece of pasta. On the first try, he missed, poking the porcelain with a tiny click. He didn't cry or give up. He simply readjusted his aim, his brain and hand working together in a complex task of fine motor coordination. On the second try, the tines of the fork found their target. He had done it. With a look of quiet triumph, he lifted the fork, the small piece of pasta clinging to the tip, a hard-won flag of victory. The effort etched on his face was the most beautiful thing James had ever seen. With the trophy on his fork, Leo paused. He stared at the pasta for a second, as if to confirm that it was real. Then, mirroring the action Chloe had modeled for him, he began to move the fork in a slow, deliberate arc toward his own face. James's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a thunderclap in his ears. Leo's mouth opened. The fork went in. His lips closed around the food. He removed the empty fork and began to chew. A single, monumental, transformative act of eating. Time stood still. The restaurant disappeared. The entire world for James Covington reconfigured itself around that soft sound of his son chewing, a sound he thought he might never hear so peacefully again. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped James's right eye and made a silent path down his cheek. He made no effort to wipe it away. It was followed by another and another. It wasn't a sob, but a silent leak of the pressure he'd been carrying for 3 years. Every doctor's appointment, every therapist's report that said limited progress, every sleepless night, every look of pity, every meal that ended in screams and despair, the weight of it all melted away with that single sound of his son chewing. It was as if a part of his soul, one he hadn't even known was frozen, had begun to thaw. That tiny piece of pasta wasn't just food. It was the embodiment of hope, a hope so visceral and real that it left him shaking, exposed, and incredibly grateful in the middle of a fancy restaurant. Chloe, still on her knees, felt the shift in the atmosphere. She didn't need to look at James to know he was crying. She could feel the ripple of his relief through the space, an almost seismic vibration, and with his release came hers. The adrenaline and intense concentration that had kept her focused began to fade, leaving behind a deep weariness and an empathy that ached. She saw, for an instant, not the mighty James Covington, but her lonely father, and her heart sank. She remembered the first time her brother Ryan had completed a 6-piece puzzle by himself. She had felt that same mix of joy and exhaustion, a triumph that is understood only by those who live on the front lines of an unseen battle. Leo's victory was, in a way, Ryan's victory, and James's was one she had cried many times herself. And Leo, after swallowing, he simply stared at his plate. His expression was neutral, calm. He seemed unaware of the emotional earthquake he had caused. For him, the world had changed. A sensory and anxiety barrier had been gently dismantled, and on the other side, there was only one simple fact. He had eaten. There was no fanfare in his mind, just the resolution of a problem. He blinked, looked down at the fork he was still holding, and then back down at his plate where the rest of the pasta waited. There was a calm curiosity in his gaze, that of someone who had just learned a new skill and was perhaps considering practicing it again. The beauty of the miracle was not in its grandeur, but in its mundane simplicity for the only person who truly mattered. Chloe knew her role on that small stage on the floor was over. The moment of pure connection needed to be sealed with an equally careful retreat. Any sudden movement, any loud word could bring the fragile house of cards tumbling down. She gave Leo a tiny, almost secretive smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared achievement. Then, placing one hand on the floor to steady herself, she began to stand. The movement was slow, her knees creaking softly in protest at having been in that position for so long. As she stood, she felt as if she were stepping through a veil, out of the quiet, intimate world she had created with Leo and back into her reality as a waitress, in uniform and with rules to follow. As Chloe rose, the real world flooded back into James's consciousness. The sounds of the restaurant, which had been a distant hum, became clear again. He heard a woman's laughter at a nearby table, the sound of a waiter describing the day's specials. The bubble of intimacy and wonder had burst. He looked at Chloe, now standing, and saw her in a new light. She was no longer the angelic, intuitive figure kneeling on the floor. She was an employee, a young woman in her workplace. The social hierarchy she had shattered with her gesture returned with a vengeance, and with it a flood of new concerns. Who was she? How did she know how to do this? And most importantly, how could he ensure that she didn't disappear from his and Leo's lives forever? James looked at her, really looked, for the first time. He saw the thin lines of weariness around her eyes, the way her hair was pulled back into a practical bun, but a few strands had escaped. He saw the quiet strength in her posture. His gaze fell on the plastic name tag pinned to her uniform. Chloe. The name echoed in his mind. He needed to speak, needed to express the magnitude of what he felt, but the words felt like foreign, useless objects in his mouth. Thank you was a joke, an insult to the depth of what she had accomplished. He opened his mouth, but what came out was only a hoarse sound, a sigh caught between gratitude and shock. He, a master of negotiation and rhetoric, was completely at a loss for words. Chloe, sensing his struggle, offered him a way out. She straightened her apron, a professional gesture that anchored her back in her role. Her smile was genuine but restrained, conveying understanding without being intrusive. "He did great," she said quietly. The words were simple, direct, and had the effect of a warm blanket on a shivering man. She wasn't asking for recognition or praise. She was simply stating a fact, validating Leo's achievement while also bringing the situation back to a level of normalcy. With that one sentence, she was managing his emotions, giving him permission to breathe and compose himself, showing an emotional intelligence that went far beyond her age or position. Reality, however, has a way of asserting itself. Across the room, the restaurant manager, a man named Mr. Thompson, who had been watching the entire scene with an expression that vacillated between horror at the breach of protocol and fascination at the outcome, decided it was time to intervene. He began walking toward their table, his face a mask of concerned authority. To him, an employee had spent 15 minutes kneeling on the floor, ignoring her fellow tables and engaging personally with a customer in a completely inappropriate manner. Chloe saw his advance out of the corner of her eye, and a familiar chill of fear ran down her spine. The magic was over. Now, she might have to pay the price for her act of compassion. James also saw the manager approaching. His mind, which had been submerged in emotion, snapped back to life with the precision of a predator. The vulnerable father gave way to the ruthless CEO in a split second. A fierce, overpowering protective instinct took over him. It was an instinct directed not only at Leo, but now at Chloe as well. The idea that this woman might face any kind of reprimand for the gift she had just given him was unthinkable, intolerable. Before Mr. Thompson could reach the table or utter a single syllable, James raised his left hand in a restrained gesture that carried the weight of billions of dollars and unquestionable authority. The manager stopped dead in his tracks, as if he had hit a glass wall. With the situation under his control, James finally found his voice. It was hoarse, still charged with emotion, but firm. He ignored the frozen manager, ignored the rest of the restaurant. His eyes were fixed solely on Chloe. He didn't offer a perfunctory thank you. He got straight to the point, his business mind already formulating the next 10 steps. "I need to talk to you," he said, and each word was clear and deliberate. "Not right now, but I need a way to find you." It wasn't a request. It was a statement. The waitress who had come into his world to soothe his son was about to find out that his father wasn't going to let her go so easily. The question was no longer whether Leo would eat. The question was now how James Covington was going to keep Chloe Miller in their lives. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. James's words, "I need to talk to you," hung in the air, thick and loaded with meaning that made Chloe's stomach churn. The relief and empathy she had felt moments before were suddenly overwhelmed by a wave of cold panic. That tone, that focused intensity was familiar in a terrible way. It was the sound of power deciding it wanted something. The fear, the one she kept locked away, the remnant of a past experience where her help had been misinterpreted and her kindness used against her, clawed at the door of her cage. She didn't want to be found. She wanted to help and disappear, to return to the safety of her anonymity. The thought of becoming entangled in the life of a man like James Covington, with his complexities, his wealth, and his pain, was terrifying. She wanted to save the boy, not become his father's property. The silence that followed was awkward. Chloe was frozen, caught between James's piercing gaze and the looming presence of her manager, Mr. Thompson, who stood at an uncertain distance, a satellite trapped in the gravitational orbit of the table. She could feel the curious glances of her co-workers, the unspoken questions. The moment that had been so intimate and sacred between her, father and son, had become a public spectacle. His compassion had thrust her into a spotlight she had never wanted, and every second in its light made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. She wanted nothing more than to pick up her trays, go back to the kitchen, and breathe in the familiar smell of food and detergent, to anchor herself back in her own world, far from the Covingtons' rarefied stratosphere. James, with the keen perception of someone who reads boardrooms like a book, sensed her hesitation and saw the fear in her eyes. He understood instantly how her words might be interpreted. In a move that was all businesslike efficiency, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a sleek leather wallet and a metal pen. The gesture changed the dynamic. He was no longer operating purely on emotion. He was operating in problem-solving mode. He took out one of his thick, embossed business cards and, in front of Chloe, turned it over and wrote something on the back. The action was formal, almost transactional. It was his way of saying, "This isn't personal, it's professional. This isn't a demand, it's a serious proposal." Chloe's gaze flicked from James's intense face to Leo again. The boy, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding, had picked up his fork again and was poking at another bite of pasta, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was Chloe's anchor in the storm of her own anxiety. That face, that newfound calm, was the result of her choice to intervene. The fear she felt was about the past, about what might happen, but the child in front of her was the present, proof that her intuition had been right. The desperation in James's eyes wasn't that of a predator, she realized. It was the desperation of a father. And that was a universal language, one she understood in her bones. With a deep breath, she pushed the fear to the back of her mind and made a new choice. James pushed his business card across the linen tablecloth. On the back, in bold, angular handwriting, was his personal cell phone number. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, his voice calmer now, more controlled. "But if I can't reach you, please call me." He paused, waiting for her to offer her own number. Chloe hesitated. Giving her personal number seemed like a big step, a line she wasn't ready to cross. Feeling Mr. Thompson's gaze still on her, she found a compromise. "You can contact me through the restaurant if you need to," she said, her voice firm but respectful. It was a boundary, a small professional wall she'd built to protect herself. It was the most she could offer at the moment. To her surprise, James didn't press the issue. He didn't frown or show any sign of impatience. He simply looked at her for a moment, seemed to understand the depth of her caution, and nodded. "I will," he said. In that small gesture of acceptance, in that respect for her boundaries, he disarmed most of her fear. The man from her past would have forced her, would have used his power to get what he wanted. James Covington, for all his intensity, had just shown that he listened, that he understood the implicit no. That nod meant more to Chloe than any promise or offer. It was a signal that perhaps this powerful man was different. With that issue settled, James turned his attention to the manager, who was still hovering in limbo. James's gaze turned steely cold. The change was so rapid it was disconcerting. "Thompson," he said, his voice low but cutting through the air like a knife. "Your service tonight was exceptional." The manager blinked in surprise. "Miss Miller," James continued, never taking his eyes off the man, "has demonstrated an initiative and level of customer care that goes far beyond any expectation. I hope your restaurant policy recognizes and properly rewards such excellence." He had, in 2 sentences, turned Chloe's greatest breach of protocol into her greatest professional triumph, completely shielding her and putting his boss in a position where he had no choice but to acquiesce. Mr. Thompson, completely taken by surprise and outmatched, could only stammer, "But yes, Mr. Covington. Of course, Mr. Covington. We greatly appreciate the initiative." He glanced at Chloe, a new expression on his face. It was no longer irritation, but a mixture of amazement, respect, and perhaps a little fear. He had just witnessed the power of one of his most important clients being used to protect one of his waitresses. He nodded stiffly at James and stepped back, disappearing back into the tapestry of the restaurant. The immediate threat to Chloe's job had evaporated, but in its place, a new, much more complicated reality had solidified. She was now under the unsolicited protection of James Covington. The intensity of the scene dissipated. His goal accomplished, James was once again a customer, though the energy around him had changed forever. He gestured discreetly to another waiter, asking for the check. The act was so mundane, so normal, that it felt surreal after the emotional drama that had just occurred. As he waited, he made no further attempts to converse with Chloe. He gave her space, allowing the situation to calm down. He watched Leo, who was now eating small bites of pasta on his own, slowly and deliberately. A small smile, the first genuine smile Chloe had ever seen, touched James's lips. It was a tired, sad smile, but undeniably real. Chloe performed her final tasks at the table, moving in a kind of haze. She cleared the bread plate, refilled James's water. Every movement was automatic. Her mind was racing miles away, trying to process the avalanche of the last 20 minutes. When she finally stepped away from the table, James's business card now safely tucked away in the pocket of her apron, she felt a profound sense of unreality. The card felt like it weighed a ton, a piece of paper that represented a detour in her life that she could not have foreseen. As she walked across the room, she was no longer just a waitress. She was a woman who carried the fate of a family in her pocket, and she had no idea what to do with it. As she stepped away from the Covingtons' table, Chloe felt as if she was stepping through a membrane between two different worlds. The dining room, with its soft glow and civilized hum, was one. The kitchen, where she was headed, was another. As she pushed open the metal door, she was greeted by a cacophony of sounds and smells, the hiss of hot pans, the clatter of dishes being stacked, the shout of a chef calling out an order. This environment, normally the familiar and comforting backdrop to her professional life, now seemed strange and overly noisy. Her mind was still tuned to the fragile stillness of the table, to the soft sound of a finger tapping on wood, the click of a fork. She felt like a diver who had surfaced too quickly, disoriented by the sudden shift in pressure and reality. Her co-workers watched her with barely concealed curiosity. They'd seen her kneeling on the floor for an eternity. They'd seen the tense exchange with Mr. Thompson and James Covington's intervention. The questions were in their eyes. Maria, who worked at the station next to hers, walked over as Chloe put away a tray. She didn't ask what had happened. She saw the distant look on Chloe's face, the way her hands shook slightly. Instead, she asked something much simpler and much more important. "Are you okay, Chloe?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, was the first thing that had felt real to Chloe since she'd picked herself up from the floor, and she nearly broke down at the kindness contained in those 3 words. Chloe looked at Maria, and for a moment she couldn't formulate a response. How could she explain? How could she put into words the complex architecture of that moment? Saying, "I helped a boy eat," was like describing a hurricane by saying, "It was a little windy." The phrase was so reductively simple that it became a lie. She shook her head, a gesture that was neither yes nor no. Her hand went instinctively to the pocket of her apron, where her business card lay, a rectangle of thick paper that seemed to burn through the fabric. "It was complicated," she managed to say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Maria knew she wouldn't get anything more out of it, and she just squeezed Chloe's arm in a gesture of silent sympathy before returning to her work. Outside the restaurant, the cool Utah night air enveloped James and Leo. James knelt on the sidewalk to help his son put on his coat, a ritual that was often met with stiffness and resistance. But not tonight. Leo's body was more relaxed, less tense. As James zipped up his jacket, Leo did something he hadn't done in months. He lifted his head and looked directly into his father's face. The eye contact was brief, a blink, but there was no panic there. There was a calm, a presence that had been absent. In that fleeting glance, James didn't just see his son, he saw the reflection of the hope that Chloe had planted. The journey home would be different. Everything, from that moment on, would be different. Before he climbed into the waiting car, James paused and took one last look through the large glass panels of the canyon's edge. The restaurant continued its ballet of luxury and privilege, oblivious to the transformation that had taken place within. His eyes searched for her, and he saw her for a moment, a small, busy figure moving between the tables. She was just a waitress, one of dozens of employees. But to James, she was a beacon. The world, which for 3 years had seemed a grey and hopeless landscape, was suddenly saturated with colour. The future, once an impenetrable fog of therapies and dead ends, now had a path uncertain, fragile, but clear. And it began with a young woman whose name he barely knew, but whose essence he felt he would recognize anywhere. The remaining 2 hours of Chloe's shift passed in a surreal blur. She operated on autopilot, her body performing familiar tasks while her mind floated elsewhere. She took orders for rare steaks and gluten-free salads, poured expensive wines whose names she couldn't pronounce, smiled at customers who couldn't really see her. Every interaction felt like a play, shallow and meaningless compared to the deep, silent communication she'd shared with Leo. Every few minutes, her hand would find its way into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing the sharp edge of James's business card. It was an anchor, a constant reminder that what had happened was real, that her life had irrevocably bifurcated that night. She found herself thinking about the details, the way the light reflected off the fork, the hollow sound of her finger on the wood, the texture of the starched linen, the intense concentration on Leo's face. These were sensory moments etched into her memory with vivid clarity. She realized that what she had done was not a trick or a technique learned from a book. It was the application of a lifetime of observation, a lifetime spent deciphering the whispers of her brother's world. All the sacrifice, all the pain, all the frustration of having to give up her dreams of studying psychology. Maybe it hadn't all been in vain. Maybe it had all been her training, the real-life university, preparing her for this very moment, this very child. When her shift finally ended, Chloe felt a sense of exhaustion that went beyond physical exhaustion. She changed in the locker room, the quiet of the place a blessing after the noise of the night. Walking to the bus stop under the city lights, she finally pulled the card from her pocket. In the orange glow of a streetlight, she read the embossed name, James Covington. Beneath it the headline, CEO, Covington Holdings, and on the back, that personal phone number, written with restrained urgency. The enormity of the situation hit her again. This wasn't just a grateful father. This was one of the most powerful men in the state, and he wanted something from her. The fear returned, but this time it was different. It was fear mixed with a dizzying sense of possibility. On the bus home, Chloe leaned her head against the cool window, watching the city lights pass by like fallen stars. She thought about Ryan. She thought about her dusty psychology books, stored in a box. She thought about the man who had hurt her in the past, who had taught her to distrust power. All these parts of her life seemed to converge on this one point. Fear was a rational voice, warning her of the risks, the complications of entering a world that was not her own. But there was another voice, a quieter one, a stronger one. It was the voice that remembered Leo's face, the quiet victory in his eyes. It was the voice that understood the language of a father's despair. And this voice whispered that sometimes the biggest risks are the ones worth taking. By the time Chloe reached her small apartment, she was exhausted, but not defeated. She had changed. She placed the business card on the kitchen table, where it felt like an artifact from another planet. She was no longer just a waitress trying to make ends meet, weighed down by a past of sacrifice. She was a woman who had discovered the value of her scars. She had learned that the deepest expertise came not from a diploma hanging on the wall, but from the quiet wisdom forged in empathy and shared pain. The fear of what tomorrow would bring was still there, a low hum in the back of her mind. But for the first time in a long time, the sense of purpose was louder. She didn't know what door the card would open, but she knew, with a calming certainty, that she held the right key in her hand. She didn't seek recognition, she just wanted to help. and she ended up building a bridge to a boy's world and rebuilding hope in a father's heart. Sometimes life overwhelms us with sacrifices and difficult experiences that teach us to be afraid. But it is precisely in our own scars that we find what no one can take away from us: the strength to transform our pain into healing for others, the value of being seen in our truth, and the courage to connect when everything tells us to retreat. If this story touched your heart, just like it touched Chloe, James, and Leo's, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that remind us of what really matters: seeing others with our hearts.